In this session, we want to take a look at Git. Okay? So I'm going to bring up my browser, and notice if I search for Git, one of the hits that I get is git-scm. Now, this is not GitHub. GitHub is a hosting service for Git repositories, but we want to take a look at the software that actually does the control and management of the different versions. So it might be worth noting here that SCM is an acronym that gets used for a lot of different things. And even within computing, it means different things. But in our case, we're talking about software configuration management, which is part of a broader field of configuration management in general. And it just deals with this notion of, hey, when we have complex systems that have a lot of parts and a lot of variations, a lot of versions or variations on the parts, how do we keep track of specific implementations and how they're configured? Okay, what versions of parts do they have? Kind of thing. So more on this to come later. In the meantime, I'm going to click on that hit and go to git-scm.com. And we find that there are some downloads, of course, that you want to jump to. No, actually, you want to go read the documentation first. I applaud that. There's a book that's freely available on Git and a lot of documentation help, tutorials, and things like that. But yes, I'm going to go ahead and just say, hey, let me download this for Windows and install it. Now, even here, you can get the Windows setup, which is an installer that's going to run and take care of a lot of issues for you. And I guess if you're unfamiliar with installing software and Git, maybe that's not a bad thing to do. But you'll notice they have a portable version over here, which is just going to be a zip file with all of the Git files in it, all the executables and so forth in it, but it'll leave it up to you to configure how it's going to run on your system, so it doesn't necessarily have to be intertwined with your operating system and becomes a little more portable. Okay, so again, if you are familiar with installing software and command line interpreters, I would suggest play with that at some point. But for the moment, you can just get the Windows setup and go through the next, finish kind of thing. And what will happen when you do that is a lot of things should magically work, even though we know there's no magic. So I'm going to come over to my start menu and type in PowerShell and bring up the Windows PowerShell command line interpreter. And you'll notice that it starts up in my C: storage device. The root of that, there's a folder called users, and in there is a subfolder called Joe. Again, this is typical Windows kind of stuff if you're familiar with that. But I should be able to, if the installation went well, type in Git and get some information back. And this is basically coming from the Git program that says, hey, I do version control. Tell me some version to control, kind of thing. If Git was not installed, if the installation didn't go well, then you would get a message about the file not being found or something. So I'm going to type GTI because I don't think I have a program called GTI. And yes, this is the type of message you'll get where the term GTI is not recognized as the name of a commandlet function, blah, blah, blah. So again, if you get a message like this, that means something went wrong in the installation. You can try the installation again or contact me and get some help. But if all went well, again, you will see a message from the Git program letting you know that, okay, it is working, it is there and it is working. And it's saying, hey, here's how you use me. And again, if you're familiar with command line interpreters and their documentation, you'll recognize that there are a bunch of options here that you can include with the Git command, and some of the subcommands for Git, like clone. So if there were an existing repository, let's say out there on GitHub, for example, we could clone it, make a copy of it locally to our machine, and work with it offline and save our changes, or what we call pushing our changes back. Init is if you wanted to create a new repository of your own. And then there are commands to add. Let's see, add is an important one. Not all files in a folder are automatically version controlled. They're not automatically tracked. We get to select which files Git is going to track in this repository. which is convenient. Our executables don't need to be tracked because we can always recreate those. In fact, that's sort of my rule of thumb: is any file that I can recreate, I don't need to track it. Okay, let's see. So cloning, you do that once, you've got a repository, and then we will go through this cycle of make some changes to the files in the repository. Then we will go do a git add. That will tell it, hey, you want to add these changes, you want to track these changes to it. And then we will do a where to go? Commit. Okay, this is probably the second most important command, subcommand to Git. And Git says, hey, okay, take a snapshot of these files, record this point in history with a message so that, again, we could come back to it later or not. It's also how we move from branch to branch, but I'm getting way ahead of myself on that. So again, we add changes, we do a commit, and then if this is a clone from somewhere else like GitHub, then we can push those changes back to GitHub. Now, since I'm mentioning GitHub, and we know that we can make changes to GitHub online without going through our own local Git, our own clone of the repository, that means then that the repository stored on GitHub's servers can get ahead of our local clone. In other words, it can have changes that we don't have, and so not much of a surprise maybe, but then we can say pull. We can do a git pull, and we can pull changes from that remote repository and then push changes back to it. Okay, well, all that sounds great, but let's actually see it in action. So I'm going to come over here to GitHub, and I want to come into my development 1240 repository. It doesn't matter. I've got a repository out here. Essentially. And what I wanted to show you was over here where it says code, we can drop this down, and this will show us the URL to that repository using either secure HTTP protocol or SSH. You decide for yourself, but we see a URL, which if we're familiar with URLs in general, we notice it starts out with a protocol, the HTTPS colon, and then the colon / says that, oh, a machine name is following it. So there is github.com, which is the DNS name for the address on the internet where that server is. But basically we're saying, okay, speak this language, speak secure HTTP to the machine at this address, and tell that machine that, hey, we want to go into this subdirectory. Okay? And then in that subdirectory, there is another directory that we want to clone. Okay? So I'll just go ahead and copy this. There's a little copy button over there. And then I'll come back to my CLI, my PowerShell. And again, users is a folder in Windows where all users have their own home directories kind of thing. So Joe is my home folder on this machine kind of thing. I'm going to make a directory and call it demo. And I'm going to, actually I'll leave my face alone and slide this over. Okay, so we can see that. And then I will change directory into demo, making that the current directory. I do have a CLI series if any of this sounds unfamiliar to you. And if I do a dir or an ls, I see that this folder is empty right now. And that's why I created it. Because what I want to do is I want to clone the repository into this folder. And it's going to make its own folder. So I just wanted to keep it separate from all my other junk that I have no idea what I have out here. So probably not a good time to be poking around in there while it's being recorded. Anyhow, I'm going to say git space clone. So I'm invoking the git program, telling it with a subcommand, hey, I want you to clone. And then Control V, I'm just going to paste in that URL and hit enter. It's going out now. My local Git program that's running on my machine is going out over the internet. It's contacted the Git.com server and said, hey, do you have a username of Joe's-TA? Yes. Okay. Does it have a repository called dev1240f22? Yes. And so then it essentially copied it to my local machine. And so now if I do an ls or dir, I will see that, yes, I have this folder here now. And so if I were to say, okay, let me cd into that and do an ls, I see there's the README file that's in there. And I can say cat readme, and I can see there's the file and the contents of it. Sharp dev1240f22 with the next line, not a sharp. Okay. So now what I want to do is I want to make some changes. I can either create a new file or I can edit this file that already exists. I think I'll do that. I think I'll edit the file that already exists there, which I can either do from my command line environment or my GUI interface, which, by the way, I should mention that there are a number of GUI programs for using Git. You can play with those if you want. I'm not going to. Git is also integrated into a lot of IDEs, integrated development environments, like Visual Studio and so forth. Again, you can use those if you want. I'm just not going to in my demonstrations. Okay. So what I'm going to do then is come over here and say, okay, I am in this PC. So there's my hard drive, there's the users folder, there's the Joe folder, and in here should be the demo that I created, demo folder, there it is. I open that up. There is the repository that was cloned. I open this up, and there is the README file that's in here, and I'm going to say, but I think it's sharp. Okay, so I've made some changes. I've done some editing. I just hit Control S to save those changes. And now if I come back to my command line interpreter, my PowerShell, and I say git space status, Git comes back and says, your branch is up to date with the origin main. So it's up to date with what's been committed with the remote repository out there on GitHub. But then it's saying there are changes that are not staged for a commit. Okay, so Git isn't going to do anything with these until I stage them, and that's where that git add command comes in. So I'm going to say git add, and dot is a wildcard for any files. You can stage only certain files kind of thing, but I'm going to do that for the moment. And now if I try git status, it comes back and says, yep, I'm still up to date with the remote repository, but now there's changes that are going to be committed. The changes to this readme.md file that was modified are going to be committed the next time I do a commit. So I'm going to say git space commit -m to add a message, because if I don't add a message, and I guess I'll just do it, it pops up with an editor and says, hey, you got to give it some kind of commit message. Okay, so I'm going to quit out of this, :q out of this, and see that it didn't save those changes yet. So I'm going to do the git commit -m and then quotes, because I'm probably going to want some spaces in here. Again, I think it's just easier when you're working to type some of these things out than it is to point and click in editors and things. Okay, anyhow, and so I'm going to say, yes, it is sharp. Okay, Again, the art of commit messages is to briefly record what changed. Okay, so I do that, and so now that commit has been stored locally on my machine. If I do a git space push, now it's gone out to GitHub again and committed that. And so if I were to come back over to GitHub and look at this README file, I'll refresh, and there we see the addition that we made to it. Okay. So that's a pattern that we'll see again and again and again. Clone a repository or init a repository once, and then git add, git commit, git push. If you do make changes online, it's not a bad idea to do a git pull to see if any changes were made before we make more changes.